Have you ever experienced that peculiar silence? That moment when you've reached out with your deepest prayers, your most urgent pleas, your most vulnerable questions, and encountered only silence in return? It's one of the most universal and yet least discussed spiritual experiences, the silence of God. For centuries, mystics have called it the dark night of the soul. Theologians have named it divine hiddenness, and ordinary believers have experienced it as that unsettling void where answers should be. This silence has shattered faith for some, deepened it for others, and remains one of spirituality's most profound mysteries. What's particularly curious about this divine silence is when it tends to appear in our lives. Have you noticed that it often emerges precisely when we most desperately seek external guidance? When we stand at life's crossroads, when we face our deepest questions of purpose and meaning, when we confront suffering that demands explanation, these are the moments when the heavens seem to go mysteriously quiet. There's something almost suspicious about this pattern, a peculiar correlation that warrants deeper investigation. This silence isn't relegated to any single spiritual tradition. From the Psalms of David crying, "Why have you forsaken me?" to Mother Teresa's decades of spiritual darkness despite her outward piety, from Buddha sitting beneath the Bodhi tree to Muhammad alone in the cave of Hira, profound silence precedes humanity's most significant spiritual breakthroughs. What if this pattern isn't coincidental? What if divine silence isn't a bug in the spiritual system, but its most essential feature? The uncomfortable question lurking beneath this pattern is both disturbing and potentially liberating. What if God goes silent not as punishment or abandonment, but as invitation? What if this silence isn't absence at all, but rather the necessary space created for something else to emerge? What if the most profound spiritual experiences don't come from hearing an external voice, but from finally discovering the voice that has been within you all along? This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of how we understand spirituality, how we navigate life's most challenging moments, and how we conceptualize the relationship between the divine and the human. If divine silence is actually spiritual invitation, how might we engage with these silent moments differently? What might emerge in the space where expected answers should be? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological depths of religious experience? A philosopher who dared to ask whether our most sacred concepts might actually be serving very different purposes than we imagine. A thinker whose own experience of profound silence led him to one of history's most disturbing and potentially liberating insights about the nature of the divine and the human. What if I told you that over a century ago, one of history's most penetrating minds uncovered the strange pattern behind divine silence and traced its implications to their unsettling conclusion? A thinker who recognized that the silence of God might not be a theological problem to solve, but rather the essential precondition for humanity's spiritual awakening. What might we learn by following his investigation? Why do we find the silence of God so disturbing? Could it be that what terrifies us isn't divine absence, but the possibility that we might have to face ourselves, our own freedom, our own responsibility, our own capacity to create meaning? What if the silence that seems like spiritual crisis is actually the birthplace of authentic spirituality? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about faith, meaning, and spirituality. They offer a perspective on divine silence, not as spiritual failure, but as spiritual invitation of the highest order. Are you ready to follow where they lead? There's a striking pattern in spiritual experience that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so consistent across traditions and throughout history that it can't be dismissed as coincidence. It emerges in the peculiar correlation between divine silence and humanity's most significant spiritual breakthroughs. This silence doesn't appear randomly. It follows a specific and predictable pattern, emerging most prominently at precisely those moments when we most desperately seek external guidance or answers. Consider how this pattern manifests across spiritual traditions. In the Jewish tradition, Moses encounters God not in thunder or earthquake, but in a still, small voice that emerges from silence. In Christian mysticism, The dark night of the soul, described by St. John of the Cross, precedes the deepest union with the divine. In Zen Buddhism, enlightenment emerges not from accumulating spiritual knowledge, but from the emptiness of no mind. In Sufi practice, the silence of meditation, muraqabah, creates the space for divine presence. In each tradition, silence isn't an obstacle to spiritual experience, but its necessary precondition. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse contexts. From ancient mystics to modern seekers, from formal religious practice to spontaneous spiritual experience, the same strange correlation appears. Profound silence precedes transformative awakening. The specific theological framework changes, the cultural context shifts, but the pattern remains strikingly consistent. Divine silence creates the space in which something new can emerge. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice when divine silence tends to appear in individual lives. It emerges not randomly, but at critical junctures, when facing life's deepest questions, when standing at significant crossroads, when grappling with suffering that demands meaning. The silence arrives precisely when external guidance would be most comforting, when answers would be most reassuring, when divine instruction would be most welcome. The anomaly extends beyond individual experience into institutional contexts. Religious communities often experience their most significant transformations, not during periods of clear divine guidance, but during times of uncertainty and questioning. The pattern repeats. Silence creates the space in which new understandings can emerge, in which calcified traditions can be reimagined, in which authentic spiritual innovation becomes possible. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge it explicitly. We discuss prayer, revelation, spiritual practices, and mystical experiences at length, but we seldom examine this specific pattern, the strange correlation between divine silence and spiritual breakthrough. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice how consistently silence precedes transformation. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that divine silence might not be a bug in the spiritual system, but its most essential feature. What if the silence of God isn't a theological problem to solve, but rather the necessary condition for authentic spiritual awakening? What if the absence of external answers creates the space in which we can finally hear something else, something that has been speaking all along, but has been drowned out by our desperate seeking for outside guidance? This is the question that haunted a 19th century philosopher whose insights into human psychology were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether divine silence might be serving a purpose far different from what we imagine. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between divine silence and human awakening? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling and potentially liberating more than a century later? In the summer of 1881, Friedrich Nietzsche was walking near Lake Silvaplana in the Swiss Alps when he had an experience that would transform his thinking, later described as 6,000 feet beyond man and time. This moment came during a period of profound silence in Nietzsche's life. He had recently resigned his professorship at the University of Basel due to debilitating health issues. His books were largely ignored by the intellectual establishment. He lived in near isolation, spending long hours in solitary walks through the mountains. By all conventional measures, Nietzsche's life appeared to be defined by absence, the absence of recognition, community, health, and direction. It was within this silence that Nietzsche experienced what he would later describe as his most important insight. Standing beside a pyramidal rock by the lake, he conceptualized what would become his doctrine of eternal recurrence, a profound affirmation of life that emerged not despite the silence, but because of it. This wasn't divine revelation in the traditional sense. It was something that emerged from within the silence itself, from the space created by the absence of external guidance and predetermined meaning. What made Nietzsche's perspective on silence especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance, but the convergence of his personal experience with his intellectual journey. Having grown up as the son of a Lutheran pastor, Nietzsche had intimate knowledge of traditional spirituality from the inside. Yet his own experience had led him to something different, not the rejection of spirituality, but its radical reimagining. Each day, as he walked in solitude through the alpine landscape, he lived the question that would come to define his philosophy. What emerges in the space created by divine silence? During these solitary walks, Nietzsche began to recognize something that few had articulated before. How often the most profound spiritual insights emerged not from clear divine guidance, but from its apparent absence. He noticed, both in his own experience and in the spiritual traditions he studied, the strange correlation between divine silence and human awakening. Far from seeing this as coincidence, he began to suspect it revealed something essential about the nature of authentic spirituality. In his notebooks from this period, filled with his increasingly aphoristic writing style, Nietzsche began to develop what would become one of his most disturbing and potentially liberating insights: that divine silence might not be a theological problem, but rather the necessary precondition for human spiritual maturity. Perhaps God goes silent, not as punishment or abandonment, but as invitation. The invitation to discover the voice that has been within us all along. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from abstract theorizing, but from Nietzsche's own experience of silence and its creative potential. Each day, as he walked in solitude through the mountains, he confronted the absence of external guidance and predetermined meaning. Each day, he discovered anew what might emerge when that absence is embraced rather than resisted. Not nihilism or despair, but the possibility of a more authentic form of spiritual experience. It was this personal confrontation with silence that gave Nietzsche's philosophical insights their unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely analyzing spiritual concepts academically, he was uncovering their psychological function through his own lived experience. As he would later write in The Gay Science, the certain prospect of death could infuse our lives with a precious, fragrant drop of levity, and now you, strange apothecary soul, have made of it a drop of poison that makes the whole of life repulsive. This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of divine silence, not as spiritual crisis, but as spiritual opportunity of the highest order. It wasn't merely a critique of traditional religiosity, but a profound insight into how silence might serve as the birthplace of authentic spirituality. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing yet potentially liberating pattern? And what implications might it have for how we understand the relationship between the divine and the human? Nietzsche's first evidence for this pattern came through his careful examination of spiritual experiences across traditions. With the careful eye of a trained philologist and the psychological insight that would later influence Freud and Jung, he began documenting a striking correlation. The most transformative spiritual breakthroughs consistently emerged not from clear divine guidance, but from periods of profound silence and apparent absence. In The Gay Science, published in 1882, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern. What is required is a new justice, and a new watchword, and new philosophers. The moral earth, too, is round. The moral earth, too, has its antipodes. The antipodes, too, have their right to exist. There is another world to discover, and more than one. Embark, philosophers. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that new spiritual and philosophical insights emerge not from following established paths, but from venturing into unmapped territory, the silence where no clear guidance exists. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying the role of uncertainty in spiritual development, which many had acknowledged before, but recognizing its specific function: how divine silence creates the necessary space for authentic spiritual discovery. The absence of clear external guidance doesn't just create confusion, it creates the possibility for something new to emerge from within. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in the mystical traditions he studied. He noted how mystics across traditions described their deepest experiences not as receiving clear divine instructions, but as encountering a silence that transcended ordinary understanding. Rather than seeing this as a failure of spiritual communication, he recognized it as revealing something essential about authentic spirituality, that it emerges not from external pronouncement, but from internal discovery, facilitated by silence. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's historical studies. Looking at the development of spiritual traditions across time, he noticed how periods of theological uncertainty and apparent divine absence often preceded periods of profound spiritual innovation. The pattern repeated. Silence created the space in which new understandings could emerge, in which calcified traditions could be reimagined, in which authentic spiritual creativity became possible. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of how spiritual language functioned in human psychology. In Human, All Too Human, he wrote, "Mystical explanations are considered deep. The truth is, they are not even shallow." This wasn't merely a critique of mysticism, but a recognition that authentic spiritual experience might lie not in elaborate theological explanations, but in the direct confrontation with silence itself. Not in answers, but in the creative space opened by their absence. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most profound insights, that what we experience as divine silence might actually be serving a purpose far different from what we imagine. Perhaps God goes silent not as punishment or abandonment, but as the necessary precondition for human spiritual maturity, creating the space in which we can discover the voice that has been within us all along. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance, but the consistent pattern across diverse spiritual contexts. From mystical experiences to historical developments, from individual spiritual journeys to institutional transformations, the same correlation appears. Silence precedes awakening. Absence creates possibility. The withdrawal of clear guidance opens the space for authentic discovery. But if Nietzsche's initial observations revealed this pattern, his deeper investigation would uncover something even more profound: how divine silence might be understood not as theological problem, but as spiritual gift of the highest order. The silence that seems like abandonment might actually be the birthplace of a more authentic form of spirituality, one based not on external authority, but on the discovery of the creative capacity within. What deeper patterns did Nietzsche discover as he continued his investigation? And what implications might these patterns have for how we understand the relationship between the divine and the human, between silence and authentic spiritual experience? As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that the pattern of divine silence leading to human awakening extended far beyond explicit religious contexts. Even in seemingly secular experiences, he found the same underlying mechanism at work: the way absence creates the space in which something new can emerge. The specific language might change, but the pattern remained consistent. Silence precedes transformation. Emptiness enables creation. The withdrawal of external guidance opens the possibility for authentic discovery. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published between 1883 and 1885, Nietzsche expanded this analysis through his concept of the death of God, not merely as theological claim, but as psychological observation about what happens when traditional sources of meaning and guidance fall silent. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? This famous passage points to Nietzsche's recognition that divine silence creates not just crisis, but creative opportunity. The necessity to discover new sources of meaning when traditional ones fall silent. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that this pattern wasn't merely religious, but revealed something fundamental about human creativity and transformation. In art, the blank canvas precedes the masterpiece. In music, silence frames and enables sound. In literature, the empty page precedes the written word. In each domain, absence isn't merely lack, but the necessary precondition for creation, the space in which something new becomes possible. Nietzsche began to see that this pattern revealed something essential about human consciousness itself, its fundamentally creative nature. In Beyond Good and Evil, he wrote, "In man, creature and creator are united. In man there is material, fragment, excess, clay, dirt, nonsense, chaos. But in man there is also creator, form-giver, hammer hardness, spectator divinity, and seventh day." This passage reveals Nietzsche's understanding that human consciousness isn't merely receptive, waiting for external guidance, but inherently creative, capable of generating meaning and value in the space opened by silence. This recognition led Nietzsche to a profound reframing of divine silence. What if God goes silent not as punishment or abandonment, but as the necessary precondition for human spiritual maturity? What if the withdrawal of clear guidance isn't failure, but invitation? The invitation to discover the creative capacity that has been within us all along. What if authentic spirituality isn't about receiving external instructions, but about discovering our own capacity to create meaning in the silence, where answers should be? The pattern became increasingly clear. What appears as divine absence might actually be the birthplace of authentic presence. The silence that seems like spiritual crisis might be the necessary space in which genuine spirituality can emerge. The withdrawal of external guidance might be the precondition for discovering the guidance that comes from within. Nietzsche articulated this understanding most clearly through his concept of the will to power, not crude domination, but the creative capacity to generate meaning and value. In silence, this creative capacity finally has space to emerge. When external voices fall quiet, we can finally hear the voice that has been speaking all along from within, not the voice of the ego with its fears and desires, but the deeper creative capacity that defines authentic human consciousness. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize divine silence not as theological problem, but as spiritual opportunity of the highest order. The silence that seems like abandonment might actually be the birthplace of a more authentic form of spirituality, one based not on external authority, but on the discovery of the creative capacity within. Perhaps God goes silent not because he has nothing to say, but because he's finally making space for us to speak. What implications might this understanding have for how we approach spiritual experience, how we navigate life's silences, and how we understand the relationship between the divine and the human? And what might it reveal about the voice that emerges when external guidance falls silent? As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse domains of human experience. The creative potential of silence wasn't isolated to individual spiritual journeys, but could be observed in cultural transformations, artistic breakthroughs, and philosophical innovations. The pattern was consistent. Wherever profound silence created the absence of predetermined guidance, something new had the opportunity to emerge, not despite the silence, but because of it. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity. After Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too. This passage points to Nietzsche's recognition that even as traditional sources of meaning fall silent, their shadows continue to prevent the emergence of something new. The real challenge isn't the silence itself, but our resistance to it, our desperate attempt to fill it with echoes, rather than allowing it to become the birthplace of authentic creation. The pattern revealed itself in the history of art, where the most significant innovations emerged not through following established rules, but through periods of uncertainty when old forms no longer sufficed. From Renaissance perspective to Impressionist light to modernist abstraction, artistic breakthroughs consistently emerged in the silence where established conventions fell away. The pattern repeated. Silence created the space in which new forms could emerge, in which calcified traditions could be reimagined, in which authentic artistic creation became possible. In philosophy, the same pattern appeared. The most significant philosophical innovations, from Socratic questioning to Kantian critique to existentialist freedom, emerged not through elaborating existing systems, but through moments of radical questioning when established frameworks fell silent. The pattern continued. The absence of clear answers created the space in which new questions could be formulated, in which unexamined assumptions could be challenged, in which authentic philosophical thought became possible. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in individual lives. Nietzsche observed how people's most significant personal transformations often emerged not during periods of clear guidance and direction, but during times of uncertainty, crisis, or apparent absence, what would later be called liminal spaces, where old identities fall away, but new ones haven't yet formed. The pattern persisted. Silence created the space in which authentic self-creation became possible. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across domains. Whether in spirituality, art, philosophy, or personal development, the same psychological mechanism operated. The withdrawal of external guidance and predetermined meaning created the necessary space for authentic creation to emerge from within. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights, that what we experience as silence or absence might actually be serving a purpose far different from what we imagine. Perhaps divine silence isn't a theological problem to solve, but rather the necessary condition for authentic spiritual maturity, creating the space in which we can discover the creative capacity that has been within us all along. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if many of our spiritual practices, philosophical frameworks, and artistic traditions have evolved primarily to help us navigate the creative potential of silence? What if the experience of divine absence serves not primarily as test of faith, but as invitation to discover the creative capacity within? This recognition wasn't merely an academic observation, but a profound challenge to how we understand spirituality, creativity, and human consciousness itself. If divine silence creates the space in which authentic creation can emerge, what might become possible if we stopped resisting this silence and instead embraced it as spiritual opportunity of the highest order? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore the deeper implications of Nietzsche's discovery. What does it mean for how we approach spiritual experience, navigate life's uncertainties, and understand the relationship between the divine and the human? And what might it reveal about the voice that emerges when external guidance falls silent? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond philosophical curiosity, into the very heart of how we understand spirituality, creativity, and human consciousness itself. If divine silence serves not as abandonment, but as invitation, the invitation to discover the creative capacity within, then our entire approach to spiritual experience requires fundamental reconsideration. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit, from camel to lion to child. The camel represents the spirit that bears the weight of external values and predetermined meaning. The lion represents the courage to say no to external authorities and create space for something new. The child represents the capacity for genuine creation, for saying yes to life from one's own authentic center. This framework reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Authentic spirituality requires not just receiving wisdom, but creating the space in which something new can emerge from within. This understanding transforms how we might approach divine silence. Rather than experiencing it as spiritual crisis or failure, we might recognize it as spiritual opportunity of the highest order, the necessary space in which authentic spirituality can emerge. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, the greatest events, they are not our loudest, but our stillest hours. Perhaps the silence that seems like divine absence is actually the stillest hour in which something profound is being born. The first implication is psychological. If divine silence creates the space in which authentic creation can emerge, then spiritual maturity might involve not desperately seeking external guidance, but learning to listen differently, not for voices from above, but for the voice that emerges from within when external noise falls away. As Nietzsche suggests in Beyond Good and Evil, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. This isn't warning against introspection, but recognition that authentic inner listening requires transformation. Learning to hear not just the ego's fears and desires, but the deeper creative capacity that defines genuine spirituality. The second implication is existential. If silence serves as invitation to discover our creative capacity, then meaning isn't something we receive from external sources, but something we participate in creating. This doesn't mean arbitrary or individualistic meaning-making, but rather recognition of our role in the creative process. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, what does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are. This isn't about becoming whatever we want, but rather discovering and expressing the creative potential that defines our authentic being. The third implication is spiritual. If divine silence creates the space in which authentic spirituality can emerge, then the relationship between the divine and the human might be understood not as passive reception, but as creative partnership. Perhaps God goes silent, not because he has abandoned us, but because he's finally inviting us to participate in the ongoing creation of meaning and value. As Nietzsche suggests through Zarathustra, I love him who creates beyond himself and thus perishes. This isn't rejection of the divine, but recognition that authentic spirituality might involve not just worshipping transcendence, but participating in its creative expression. Perhaps the most profound implication is transformative. If divine silence serves as invitation to discover our creative capacity, then the spiritual journey might involve not just finding God, but becoming more fully human, expressing the creative potential that defines our authentic being. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, what is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. This isn't crude glorification of domination, but recognition that authentic spirituality involves expressing, rather than suppressing, our creative capacity, becoming not less human, but more fully human in all our creative potential. What does this mean for how we approach spiritual experience, navigate life's uncertainties, and understand the relationship between the divine and the human? And what might it reveal about the voice that emerges when external guidance falls silent? The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond individual psychology into what might be called a conspiracy of silence, not in the sense of malicious intent, but rather as a collective pattern that shapes human experience in ways we rarely acknowledge explicitly. This isn't a conscious conspiracy, but rather a cultural evolution driven by the profound creative potential of silence and our ambivalent relationship to it. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche traced how this pattern evolved through religious and philosophical traditions that both revealed and concealed the creative potential of silence. What began as genuine recognition of how divine absence creates space for human creativity gradually became institutionalized into systems that promised certainty, precisely where uncertainty might be most spiritually productive. The pattern persisted. The creative potential of silence was simultaneously acknowledged and feared, revealed and concealed, celebrated and controlled. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by the basic human ambivalence toward freedom and creativity. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the desire for freedom of will in the superlative metaphysical sense, the desire to bear the entire and ultimate responsibility for one's actions oneself and to absolve God, the world, ancestors, chance, and society therefrom, involves nothing less than to be precisely this causa sui and to pull oneself up into existence by the hair, out of the swamps of nothingness. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that the creative freedom opened by divine silence is both liberating and terrifying, the source of both our greatest spiritual potential and our deepest existential anxiety. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it manifests across spiritual traditions.
Even as religious frameworks emphasize surrender to divine guidance, they simultaneously contain mystical traditions that recognize how silence creates the space for authentic spiritual discovery. Even as theological systems promise certainty, they simultaneously harbor apophatic traditions that approach the divine primarily through negation and silence. The pattern persists. The creative potential of silence is both acknowledged and feared, revealed and concealed, celebrated and controlled.
This pattern extends into educational systems that often emphasize receiving knowledge over creating it. Therapeutic approaches that sometimes prioritize external expertise over internal wisdom, and cultural narratives that frequently value certainty over the creative potential of uncertainty. Each domain develops its own language, but the psychological pattern remains consistent: ambivalence toward the creative freedom opened by silence. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability. As traditional religious frameworks lose cultural authority, the same psychological pattern continues through secular forms: scientific certainty, technological solutions, expert guidance. that promise to fill the silence with clear answers rather than embracing its creative potential. Different language, same psychological pattern. Ambivalence toward the creative freedom opened by divine silence. This recognition reveals something profound about modern spirituality, that it often continues the same psychological pattern while changing only the language. The person who desperately seeks scientific certainty, technological solutions, or expert guidance to fill the silence where answers should be, is engaging in essentially the same psychological mechanism as the person who seeks clear divine instruction, avoiding the creative potential of silence through appeals to external authority. Nietzsche's penetrating insight wasn't merely that divine silence might serve as spiritual invitation, but that our response to this invitation reveals something essential about human psychology, our simultaneous longing for and fear of the creative freedom that silence makes possible. The real conspiracy isn't religious doctrine, but the deeper human tendency to both seek and avoid the creative potential of silence. This pattern raises profound questions about spiritual development, creative expression, and the possibility of authentic living. If we've been collectively engaged in both seeking and avoiding the creative potential of silence, what might become possible if we consciously embraced this potential? What version of spirituality might emerge if we stopped experiencing divine silence as crisis and started recognizing it as invitation? The invitation to discover the creative capacity that has been within us all along? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore why this pattern has remained largely unacknowledged and what it might mean for the possibility of genuine spiritual transformation. Why has the creative potential of divine silence remained largely unacknowledged despite its profound influence on spiritual experience? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective ambivalence driven by the basic human relationship to freedom and creativity. Acknowledging the full implications of Nietzsche's discovery would mean facing both the liberation and the responsibility that come with recognizing our role in the creative process, a prospect simultaneously appealing and terrifying. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this ambivalence. What if some day or night a demon were to steal into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, "The eternal hourglass of existence is turned over again and again, and you with it, a dust grain of dust"? Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that the same experience, facing the absence of predetermined meaning, can be experienced either as crushing, burden, or as liberating opportunity, depending on one's relationship to creative freedom. Religious institutions have an understandable stake in emphasizing divine guidance over divine silence, acknowledging that God's primary spiritual gift might be absence rather than presence, silence rather than instruction, would fundamentally transform traditional religious authority. It's not that religious leaders consciously suppress this insight, but rather that institutional religion naturally emphasizes the aspects of spiritual experience that support rather than challenge established frameworks. Yet mystical traditions within every major religion have consistently recognized the creative potential of silence. From the apophatic theology of Pseudo-Dionysius to the emptiness of Zen Buddhism, from the dark night of the soul in Christian mysticism to the concept of Tzimtzum in Kabbalah, spiritual traditions have consistently contained elements that acknowledge how divine withdrawal creates the space in which authentic spirituality can emerge. The pattern persists. The creative potential of silence is simultaneously acknowledged and marginalized, celebrated by mystics, and viewed with suspicion by institutions. Educational systems often perpetuate this pattern by prioritizing the reception of existing knowledge over the creative potential of not knowing. As Nietzsche writes in Twilight of the Idols, one must learn to see, one must learn to think, one must learn to speak and write. The goal in all three is a noble culture. This insight reveals how education might serve not just to transmit existing knowledge, but to develop the creative capacity that emerges in the space where predetermined answers fall away. Cultural narratives frequently reinforce this pattern by celebrating certainty over the creative potential of uncertainty. From religious fundamentalism to scientific positivism, from political dogmatism to therapeutic prescription, dominant cultural frameworks often promise clear answers precisely where the absence of answers might be most productively creative. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of systems that address the basic human ambivalence toward creative freedom. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains largely unacknowledged because confronting it would mean facing what Nietzsche called the greatest weight, the recognition that meaning isn't something we passively receive, but something we actively create. This prospect is so psychologically challenging that many prefer the comfort of predetermined frameworks, even if they come at the cost of authentic creativity. The pattern persists, not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for certainty over ambiguity, clear guidance over creative freedom, and predetermined meaning over the terrifying responsibility of conscious creation. As Nietzsche writes in Human, All Too Human, the desire for certainty is stronger than the desire for wisdom. This passage reveals his recognition that we often prefer comforting answers over the creative potential of questions that remain open. What does this mean for the possibility of authentic spiritual development and genuine creative expression? If we've been collectively engaged in both seeking and avoiding the creative potential of divine silence, what might become possible if we consciously embraced this potential? What version of spirituality might emerge if we stopped experiencing divine silence as crisis and started recognizing it as invitation? The invitation to discover the creative capacity that has been within us all along. As we approach our final exploration, we'll examine what Nietzsche's discovery reveals about the possibility of genuine spiritual transformation and the path toward what he called becoming who you are, not through finding clear divine guidance, but through embracing the creative responsibility that emerges in divine silence. The final question isn't whether God exists, but whether divine silence serves as spiritual crisis or spiritual invitation. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about human spirituality, our tendency to interpret silence as absence, rather than as the necessary space in which authentic presence can emerge. But it also reveals something even more significant: the possibility of a spirituality based not on receiving external guidance, but on discovering the creative capacity that silence finally allows us to hear. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of the Übermensch, not a superior being in the crude sense, but rather a way of living that embraces the creative responsibility that defines authentic human existence. I teach you the Overman, Zarathustra says. Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? This question points to Nietzsche's recognition that authentic spirituality requires overcoming our tendency to seek refuge in external authority, and instead embracing the creative capacity that defines our humanity. This isn't about rejecting spiritual experience, but transforming how we understand it. Perhaps the most authentic spiritual moments aren't when we receive clear guidance from above, but when we discover the voice that emerges from within, when external noise falls away. Perhaps God's greatest gift isn't presence but absence, the silence that creates the space in which we can finally hear ourselves. What might this look like in practice? It means approaching divine silence not as spiritual failure, but as spiritual opportunity of the highest order. When prayers seem unanswered, when guidance seems absent, when the heavens seem silent, these might be precisely the moments of greatest spiritual potential, if only we learn to listen differently. Not for voices from above, but for the voice that emerges from within when external noise falls away. It means developing practices that don't just fill silence with noise, but create the conditions in which authentic listening becomes possible. Meditation, not as technique for achieving special states, but as practice in hearing what emerges when mental chatter subsides. Prayer, not just as speaking to God, but as creating the silence in which we can finally hear ourselves. Scripture, not just as source of answers, but as catalyst for questions that open creative space within. Most importantly, it means recognizing that the voice that emerges in silence isn't just the ego with its fears and desires, but something deeper. What Nietzsche called the will to power in its authentic sense, not as domination, but as creative expression of one's deepest nature. This isn't arbitrary self-invention, but discovery and expression of the creative potential that defines authentic being. The path forward isn't about rejecting spirituality, but transforming it, moving from a childish dependence on external authority toward a mature recognition of our creative participation. Whether within religious frameworks or beyond them, authentic spirituality requires embracing the fundamental challenge of human existence, creating meaning in the space opened by divine silence. What might become possible if you stopped experiencing divine silence as crisis and started recognizing it as invitation, the invitation to discover the voice that has been within you all along? What might emerge if you approached unanswered prayers not as spiritual failure, but as the necessary space in which authentic spirituality can finally emerge? What voice might you discover if you stopped filling silence with noise and instead learned to listen differently, not for guidance from above, but for the creative capacity that silence finally allows you to hear? The answer to these questions won't come from external revelation, but from your own courageous confrontation with silence and its creative potential. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "What does your conscience say? You shall become the person you are." This isn't about becoming whatever you want, but rather discovering and expressing the creative potential that defines your authentic being. The real spiritual journey isn't finding clear divine guidance, but embracing the creative responsibility that emerges in divine silence. It's recognizing that meaning isn't something you passively receive, but something you actively create. Not alone, not arbitrarily, but in relationship with others and in response to the world you inhabit. Are you ready to stop experiencing divine silence as abandonment and start recognizing it as invitation? The invitation to discover that the voice you've been seeking outside has been within you all along. The choice, as always, is yours. But perhaps in that choice itself, in that embracing of creative responsibility, you'll discover what authentic spirituality has always been about. Not finding God, but becoming more fully human.